Well, as protests broke out across the country over the weekend, President Trump stayed largely silent, except for a slew of tweeting that appeared to actually stoke tensions. A senior administration official tells the Washington Post that the president and some of his advisors calculated that he should not speak to the nation because he had nothing new to say. He had no tangible policy or action to announce yet. But in a series of tweets on Saturday morning, Trump addressed the protests that took place outside the White House. He first thanked the Secret Service, saying the agents let protesters scream and rant as much as they wanted. He added, "Big crowd, professionally organized, but nobody came close to breaching the fence. If they had, they would have been greeted with the most vicious dogs and most ominous weapons I've ever seen." The president also appeared to invite his own supporters to gather outside the White House, tweeting in part, "Tonight, I understand, is MAGA night at the White House." Here's how he responded when asked about his tweets.
With your tweets today, are you concerned that you might be stoking more racial violence or more racial discord?
No, not at all. MAGA says, "Make America great again." These are people that love our country. I have no idea if they're going to be here. I was just asking. But I have no idea if they're going to be here. But MAGA is Make America Great Again. By the way, they love African-American people. They love black people. MAGA loves the black people.
According to NBC News, President Trump has dismissed advice from his allies urging him to tone down his rhetoric. Multiple people familiar with the discussion say there is broad agreement among Trump's allies that his current, largely incendiary messaging on protesters could backfire politically and also potentially further fuel the turmoil. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, the only African-American Republican in the Senate, said yesterday that he told the president some of his tweets about the violence that has swept the nation were, quote, not constructive, and that Trump was responsive to his suggestions for ways to improve his message.
I spoke with the president yesterday morning, and he and I had a good conversation about what are the next steps. I told him what I'm going to tell you, which is, Mr. President, it helps us when you focus on the death, the unjustified, in my opinion, the criminal death of George Floyd. Those tweets are very helpful. Mr. President, it is helpful when you leave with compassion.
But Senator Scott, I've got a minute left. Did you speak truth to power? And did you say to him, when you talk about thugs, when you talk about looting and shooting, and you talk about vicious police dogs, what did you say about that?
I used similar words that you just used, which was we talked about the fact that there is a constructive way to have a dialogue with the nation in this similar fashion that we had a conversation after Charlottesville. I think his tweets yesterday were far more responsive after the conversation. I'm thankful that we can have that conversation. We don't always agree. I didn't agree with some of his tweets beforehand, but we had the ability to sit down and dialogue on how we move this nation forward and not let the detractors get in the way of what has been a pretty phenomenal couple of years economically.
Well, you look at actually what Senator Scott said, Mika, and he brought up, it's interesting that he brought up Charlottesville and Donald Trump's moral equivocation in Charlottesville, because actually the president's top aides were telling reporters that this, they believed, was his low point since Charlottesville. The thugs comment, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. When he talked about vicious dogs, that obviously is code. And there's not a civil rights leader that doesn't think back to Bull Connor releasing vicious dogs on protesters back in the 1960s. There you have an image from Birmingham. When he talks about the vicious dogs, when he talks about when the looting starts, the shooting starts, which is, of course, the catchphrase of a bigoted segregationist from the 1960s. And then when he talks about MAGA night at the White House, which of course, certainly to people inside the White House, their fear was that it seemed like the president was trying to start a riot outside of the gates of his own White House. That's obviously, again, the White House insiders consider this to be, according to reports, his low point since Charlottesville.
Well, and it's sort of like two things going on, this sort of sowing fear and hate and stowing the violence on Twitter. And yet a lot of people felt during that moment in the Rose Garden on Friday when he chose not to speak about George Floyd and everything that was going on, and he turned around and walked away, turned his back on America. The question started popping up, is he afraid to do anything? What is holding him back? And through our worst times, Jonathan Lemire, through our worst times as a country in these past 3 months, it seems he's in a state of withdrawal at all times, whether it be from stepping up on testing and nationalizing it and getting this going and moving us through the virus and the pandemic, or withdrawing from the WHO, or withdrawing from the opportunity to calm Americans' fears and try and calm the situation. He turns and walks away.
Mika, there was a moment last night in Washington, D.C., just after 11 o'clock p.m. when the city's curfew went into effect. There were protests in Lafayette Park, just across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House. A few fires were burning, loud chants. Both of those things could be seen and heard from the building. And what happened to the White House? The exterior lights that always illuminate the building were turned off, and the building was plunged into darkness. And I think for a lot of Americans, that's been representative of the lack of leadership from President Trump. And a number of his allies have the same concern right now. Of course, the lights went out for security reasons. That is why Secret Service made that decision, because the protests were so close to the building. But it's emblematic. The last few days of the White House, as you mentioned, the president on Friday had an opportunity. He had a Rose Garden event. He was going to talk about China and his anger there about the WHO and, of course, the pandemic. But there were plans for him also to address George Floyd's death. He did not. He chose not to give those remarks. He walked away. Friday night, as the protests really got out of hand in Lafayette Park, surprising Secret Service agents rushed the president to the underground bunker at the White House, which was usually used just in the case of terrorist attacks. Most famously, that's where the Vice President Cheney, was taken on September 11th. President Trump spent about an hour there Friday night. Saturday morning, of course, we had this series of tweets seeming to want to almost incite the riot with MAGA night. And for the record, there don't seem to be many Trump supporters who showed up that evening. And the praise of the Secret Service, and even suggesting that they would turn to really violent means to turn back the protesters, which, according to our reporting, upset a number of the agents. Of course, that was not their intent. We had a weekend full of divisive tweets from the president, leaning into political scores, attacking Democratic governors and mayors, trying to take credit for quieter nights because of the National Guard deployment, even though they had been out there days before in places like Minneapolis. There was also, Mika, a discussion to address the nation. There were top advisors, had thoughts about how the president, speaking to the country, perhaps Saturday night or last night from the Oval Office, they decided not to do it. They felt there were not any policy proposals to give out. The president wasn't sure of a message to give. They didn't feel like there was a sense of a real note of unity that he could sound. They also remembered his last Oval Office address in the early days of the pandemic, which was a disaster and sowed confusion and fear. So they opted not to do it. And instead, he has remained quiet and out of sight outside of these few inflammatory tweets.
Well, can I just,
yes.
John Meacham, just historically, I know there are no parallels, but we need to bring it up right now. We're in the middle of a recession turning into a depression. We're in the middle of the worst pandemic, worst healthcare crisis in over a century, the worst rioting since 1968. And over the course of this year, where the president has faced unprecedented economic hardship since 1929, unprecedented health care crisis since 1918, now unprecedented rioting since 1968, we have a president who's in the middle of this incredible shrinking act. He's doing little more than tweeting.
I mean, as you say, the analogies are imprecise, and I hate to throw any of his predecessors into the corner with him. But this is a lot like the winter spring of 1968, when President Johnson left the race, functionally resigned, when you think about it, having won so big in 1964, As we've talked about, James Reston wrote the morning after the 1964 election that conservatism was dead in America for a generation. But then fewer than 4 years later, President Johnson, because of Vietnam, because of the riots, because of the backlash, which was a phrase that came into the vernacular about white workers lashing back at black workers who might be taking their jobs, which was not necessarily a Southern phenomenon, but also a national one. That wild complexity of issues functionally drives President Johnson out of office. It takes him out of the presidential race. Given the way Lyndon Johnson was wired, for him not to be able to run for office was almost a death sentence. And in fact, he did die within 5 years. So, but that was a moment where circumstances engulfed Johnson, who had done immensely important things on the home front. And so that's where the analogy breaks down. But if you're looking for a chaotic moment, this would be, I think, the first week, last week of March, first week of April 1968, which began with Dr. King giving a sermon at the Washington National Cathedral. Johnson gets out of the race on Sunday night. Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis on the 4th. Robert Kennedy gives the remarkable talk about Dr. King's death in Indianapolis. And then America burned. And so I think we're closer to that than at any time since then.
Wow. Well,
thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.